August 22, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Pre-dawn. Steam climbs off the mess hall roof in slow, white ribbons and vanishes into cold air. The pine-dark tree line holds the last stars while floodlights hum above barbed wire. Inside, the heat is abrupt. Boots scuff concrete. Enamel trays slide on metal rails. The smell is a mixture of boiled water, starch, disinfectant soap, and something faintly sweet that does not belong to hunger. At the end of the serving line, Japanese prisoners of war stand shoulder to shoulder, faces drawn tight not by frost but by expectation. They have been trained to believe that capture is a kind of spiritual extinction. To be held alive by the enemy is not merely defeat. It is disgrace that stains the family name, a dishonor so complete that death would have been cleaner. A guard sets down cups, not bowls, cups. The liquid is dark and hot, carrying an aroma many of the prisoners have not smelled in years. Coffee. Then, with a motion so casual it seems almost careless, the guard tips a small ladle and lets cream fall into the surface. A pale swirl blooms outward and disappears into the black. Not much, just enough to soften bitterness. In that moment, the war tightens down to a single sensory fact. The enemy has enough to waste sweetness on captives. This moment matters because it is not just an anecdote about kindness. It is a collision between two systems, two ways of organizing life in wartime, and it is rooted in documents, inspection reports, policy, and the measured machinery of logistics. By the end of the Second World War, the United States held more than 425,000 Axis prisoners on its soil, spread through a vast network of permanent camps and branch camps. Within that total, the Japanese were a small fraction, about 5,424 prisoners. Yet their captivity posed a psychological challenge that Americans came to understand with unusual clarity. Japanese soldiers were taught not to surrender, and those who did surrender often expected torture or execution. Their surprise at American food was not sentimental, it was structural. Source: https. Study Thepast. Spring Materials Japanese %20 prisoners %20 of %20 war %20 in %20 America. PDF. Camp McCoy itself was not an obscure footnote. Wartime and post-war histories describe the coffee cup becomes the story's recurring symbol, not because it is romantic, but because it is precise. It holds evidence that can be tasted. It represents what American power often looked like to enemies who had been fed on scarcity and indoctrination. Abundance made routine, not sacred. Distribution governed by policy, not by personal whim. The Japanese prisoners at McCoy did not arrive as men prepared for surrender. Many arrived as men who had already crossed the line where survival felt like shame. The Imperial Japanese Military Field Code, adopted in 1941, demanded that a soldier avoid the dishonor of capture, even if that meant death. The doctrine was so deeply ingrained that surrender was treated as a moral failure. That is one reason the United States took so few Japanese prisoners across much of the Pacific War. Battles that produced thousands of Japanese dead might yield only dozens of captives, most wounded or unconscious. Source: https. Study Thepast. Com 5388 Spring 12 Materials Japanese %20 prisoners %20 of %20 war %20 in %20 America. PDF. Even American records admitted a grim parallel truth. Some American troops, hardened and fearful after years of brutal fighting, were reluctant to take prisoners at all. In a frank 1943 intelligence memo, the Army conceded that it sometimes took the promise of 3 days' leave and some ice cream to persuade soldiers to bring in the first live Japanese prisoner. The war had taught both sides to expect treachery and death, and those expectations shaped every first encounter between captor and captive. Source: https. Study Thepast. Com 5388 Spring 12 Materials Japanese %20 prisoners %20 of %20 war %20 in percent 20 America. PDF. So when Japanese prisoners found themselves not beaten, not starved, not stripped naked for humiliation, but processed through a system, deloused, medically examined, issued rations, they struggled to interpret it. The prisoners searched for the hidden cruelty, the delayed punishment. They assumed generosity was bait, and in a sense it was, but not in the crude way they expected. American policy toward POWs was shaped by a tangle of law, strategy, and public image. The 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, though Japan had not ratified the POW Convention, set a standard the United States often used as a benchmark anyway. Its language insisted that prisoners be treated humanely and, crucially, that the food ration of prisoners of war shall be equal in quantity and quality to that of troops at base camps. Source: https history state gov/historicaldocument/frus 1929 v0 1/d216. That sentence did more than guarantee calories. It forced a comparison. It made the prisoner's body a measuring instrument. If the prisoner ate as the captor's own troops ate, then captivity became a showcase of the captor's capacity and discipline. Food was no longer only sustenance. It became proof. And proof is more persuasive than propaganda. A Japanese prisoner could dismiss American leaflets as lies. He could dismiss loudspeakers as tricks. But he could not easily dismiss his own tongue and stomach when confronted with a breakfast that looked like a restaurant menu compared to the half rations and improvised survival many had known on the front. Arnold Kramer recorded a typical menu, served at Camp Angel Island on September 16, 1944, one of the processing points for Japanese POWs before prisoners were routed onward for interrogation and longer-term confinement. The list is striking in its ordinariness and its variety. Breakfast: sausages, rice, browned crusts, apples, coffee, milk, sugar. Lunch: sukiyaki, cabbage salad, rice, caramel pudding, water. Dinner: spaghetti and hash, baked tomatoes, lettuce and tomato salad, rice, cakes, cocoa. Source: https study thepast com 5388 Spring 12 Materials Japanese percent 20 Prisoners percent 20 of percent 20 War percent 20 in percent 20 America. PDF. Coffee appears there as a matter-of-fact component, paired with milk and sugar, the very things that made it luxurious to men who had lived for months on the edge of starvation. And from Angel Island, prisoners could be sent deeper into the American system, to interrogation sites like Tracy, California, and then to long-term camps such as McCoy, Wisconsin. Source: https study thepast com Spring Materials Japanese percent 20 Prisoners percent 20 of percent 20 War percent 20 in percent 20 America. PDF. American authorities understood, with almost clinical attention, how the Japanese prisoner's mind moved through captivity. Kramer describes a pattern intelligence officers came to expect. In the first 48 hours after capture, prisoners were often convinced they would be tortured and killed. They were confused, silent, or unreliable. After several days, when they realized they would not be tortured, a second phase set in. Fear softened into gratitude, and gratitude produced talk. For 10 days to 2 weeks, many were highly receptive and informative. Then came the third phase. They grew accustomed to treatment, became annoyed by questioning, and stopped yielding reliable information. Source: https study thepast com Spring Materials Japanese percent 20 Prisoners percent 20 of percent 20 War percent 20 in percent 20 America. PDF. That is not a fairy tale about American kindness. It is a description of an intelligence method that treated dignity as a lever. But even when policy is explained by strategy, the emotional weight of the experience remains. The Japanese soldiers' expectations, torture, starvation, execution, were not irrational. They had been taught these things. They had seen what their own army did to prisoners and civilians. They had heard the stories and absorbed the certainty. The enemy would repay cruelty with cruelty. That was how war was supposed to work. Then instead the enemy offered rules. In Hawaii, at WWII, another camp that held POWs and civilians, National Park Service material explicitly notes that prisoner-of-war camps were designed to follow the Geneva Convention, and that the food provided was even the same as the type given to U.S. soldiers. The camp's 1943 report described large kitchens and mess halls with capacity to feed 1,000 or more prisoners, and the routine details of showers, pit latrines, and tents. Source: https://www.nps.gov/hono/learn/historiculture/prisoners of war, HTM. A prisoner raised inside a militarized culture understood hierarchy. He understood obedience. He understood punishment. What he struggled to understand was impersonality, this American habit of doing things the same way for everyone, as if the system itself was more important than the coffee cup repeated morning after morning became a symbol of that impersonality. A guard might hate the prisoner. Another guard might pity him, but the ration came anyway. The kitchen opened anyway. The cup was filled anyway. Cream was poured anyway. And that consistency was its own kind of violence against propaganda. Because Japanese wartime ideology depended on a particular narrative. America was decadent, soft, chaotic, morally inferior. American wealth was supposed to be proof of weakness, not strength. Yet here, inside American captivity, wealth appeared not as chaos but as order. The prisoners saw it in the sheer regularity of meals, the predictable availability of staples, the strange normalcy of variety. Even coffee had a different meaning in the United States during wartime than many prisoners might imagine. Coffee on the American home front was rationed from November 1942 to July 1943. The National Park Service notes that consumer demand remained high, while shipping threats and diverted cargo capacity reduced supply. Coffee that did arrive was prioritized for the military. The rationing system gave adults limited amounts, 1 pound every 5 to 6 weeks, so the military could keep its supply lines flowing. Source: https://www.nps.gov/articles/000/coffee rationing on the World War II home front. HTM. That context matters because it shows the coffee cup is not simply abundance. It is prioritized abundance, abundance shaped by planning and sacrifice. The American prisoner, sitting behind wire, is drinking a liquid that American civilians had once queued and rationed for, accepting limits so the war machine could be fueled. The prisoner drinks not only coffee, he drinks the evidence of a society willing to regulate itself in order to fight. The American military considered coffee essential for morale and alertness, and rations were designed around it. Quartermaster history traces coffee's formal appearance in Army rations back to the 19th century, and shows how it remained a key component as rations evolved into the highly specialized systems of World War II. Soluble coffee in operational rations, packed into standardized units to keep soldiers functioning. Source: so when a Japanese prisoner is given coffee, especially coffee softened with cream, it is not merely a gesture of politeness. It is a glimpse of industrialized morale. It is proof that the enemy has built a war effort where even small comforts are manufactured, packaged, shipped, and distributed at scale. The emotional contrast deepens when you consider what many Japanese soldiers had been living on in the late war. Cut rations, disease, isolation, and the slow wasting of the body. Kramer notes that many Japanese arrived in American custody, malnourished and suffering from illnesses such as malaria, skin disease, intestinal worms, and combat wounds. American processing included medical examination and treatment. Some were sent to hospitals like Letterman General Hospital for more serious care. Source: https://studythepast. Com 5388 Spring 12 Materials Japanese, percent 20 prisoners, percent 20 of percent, 20 war percent 20, in percent 20 America. PDF. For men trained to believe the enemy was a barbarian, this was not simply relief. It was ideological vertigo. At first, many interpreted it as humiliation by comfort, an attempt to break them by feeding them too well. Others suspected poison. Others suspected a trap. Perhaps the Americans wanted them strong enough to work, or strong enough to interrogate, or simply wanted to display them as trophies. The truth is more complex. The United States did have ulterior motives. Washington hoped that adhering to humane treatment might protect American prisoners in enemy hands, even if Japanese authorities ignored Geneva. Cramer notes the War Department's belief that U.S. adherence to the Geneva Convention would somehow benefit American captives. Source https. Study Thepast. Com 5388 Spring 12 Materials Japanese, percent 20 prisoners, percent 20 of percent, 20 war percent 20, in percent 20 America. PDF. But it was also about control. A prisoner who is fed, housed, and treated becomes easier to manage. A prisoner who is not constantly at the edge of death becomes predictable. A prisoner whose basic needs are met is less likely to riot, less likely to panic, less likely to attempt desperate violence. In other words, food was not only murder. At Camp McCoy, the Japanese prisoner world was organized into compounds, with barracks, mess halls, and day rooms. Cramer describes day rooms equipped with furniture, playing cards, gramophones, and Japanese-language books donated by the YMCA. The camp also maintained canteens where prisoners could buy items like toothpaste, shoe polish, candy, cigarettes, soft drinks, and produce at market price, purchased with canteen coupons rather than cash, tied to pay deposited in a Treasury Trust fund. Source, https. Study Thepast. Com 5388 Spring 12 Materials Japanese, percent 20 prisoners, percent 20 of percent, 20 war percent 20, in percent 20 America. PDF. Even that detail, cigarettes, coupons, canteens, was part of the spectacle of American capacity. It suggested a society where systems exist to manage even the small economies inside a prison camp. For some Japanese prisoners, this new environment triggered a rapid internal transformation. Cramer notes an American official's recollection that some Japanese prisoners, after their requests for suicide were denied, discarded their old views and assisted the United States, locating ammunition dumps, explaining forced dispositions, even helping guide bombing missions to targets. The official described it as if they had turned over a new page, having failed at one code of conduct and naturally taking up another. Source, https. Study Thepast. Com 5388 Spring 12 Materials Japanese, percent 20 prisoners, percent 20 of percent, 20 war percent 20, in percent 20 America. PDF. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the story, the speed with which ideology can crumble when it is built on absolutes. If the absolute rule is death before capture, then capture itself proves the rule's failure. A man living behind wire is already outside the old code. The question becomes, what fills the vacuum? Sometimes it is resentment, sometimes it is compliance, sometimes it is numbness. But sometimes it is a quiet reevaluation, a willingness to see the enemy as a society rather than a demon. That reevaluation often began not with political lectures but with sensory contradictions. The smell of fresh bread, the shock of meat, the sweetness of pudding, the warmth of cocoa, the strange stability of breakfast arriving at the same hour each day, and again the coffee cup, this small vessel of routine. The Japanese prisoners also encountered another destabilizing contrast. Within their own prisoner community, social order collapsed. Rank mattered, but it mattered differently. Shame existed, but it shifted. Tensions flared between Army and Navy personnel, between early captured prisoners and later captured prisoners, between those who clung to militarist identity and those who adapted. Cramer describes the persistent internal problems at McCoy, rivalry between branches, arrogance between cohorts, and the ever-present question of honor and suicide. Source: https studythepast. Com 5388 Spring 12 Materials Japanese, percent 20 prisoners, percent 20 of percent 20 war percent 20, in percent 20 America. PDF. In that unstable social world, American routine became a kind of external skeleton holding the days together. The prisoner could hate it, but he could also rely on it. The coffee came. The head count came. The lights out came. The next morning came. And the cream, pale and persistent, became an uninvited teacher. It showed that in America, even wartime life could include softness without collapsing into weakness. This is where the symbolism deepens. The coffee cup is not only abundance, it is democracy's claim that institutions can be strong enough to allow restraint. That claim was reinforced by the inspection regime. Geneva's model depended on oversight, protecting powers, neutral inspections, reports. Even when the United States ran secret interrogation sites that bent the convention's spirit, the visible POW camp system remained deeply concerned with appearances and standards. The United States knew that international scrutiny existed and that treatment of prisoners could boomerang back onto American captives abroad. Source: https history state gov/historicaldocuments/frus 1929 v0 1/d216. But for Japanese prisoners, the effect was personal. They had been trained in a worldview where surrender meant the enemy's total control over your body, your fate determined by hatred and whim. At the end of the war, Camp McCoy's own wartime newspaper announced, "War is over." And the Post shifted to the immense task of processing soldiers and transitions. The machinery of mobilization became the machinery of demobilization. The camp story as a wartime institution is steeped in scale, tens of thousands processed, fed, housed, moved. Source: https://www.dvidshub. net/news/547183 /80 years later recalling End World War Omen to Camp McCoy. For the prisoners, the war's end did not instantly dissolve the fences. They still woke to counts, marched to meals, and watched the seasons change across wire. But something had already happened inside them, in small increments, in repeated mornings. A man can withstand brutality and still cling to his ideology. Cruelty confirms what he was taught. But consistent restraint, delivered by a system with the capacity to be cruel and the power to choose otherwise, forces a different kind of reckoning. It suggests that your leaders may have lied, not only about the enemy's savagery, but about what power must look like. And that is the transformation at the core of this story. The shift from seeing America as a monstrous other to seeing it as a functioning society, capable of producing and distributing resources on a scale that makes mercy possible. The coffee cup, then, becomes a silent referendum. It is lifted in hands that once held rifles. It is warmed by breath that once whispered prayers for death before capture. It is filled again and again as days pass, an object so ordinary that it becomes impossible to interpret as a trick forever. The cream's pale spiral repeats like a clock face, an emblem of surplus, of choice, of a system that can afford softness. Even American abundance had limits. Americans rationed coffee on the home front. They were told to reduce and stretch, to accept less in each cup so others could have enough. The rationing posters and guidance were not merely about supply. They were about civic discipline, the idea that shared sacrifice could be organized. So the Japanese prisoner, drinking coffee with cream, is drinking something that carries the aftertaste of a larger American habit. A society that argues, negotiates, complains, and still, under pressure, can coordinate itself to deliver essentials to the front and still feed a prisoner according to a standard rather than a grudge. This is not to pretend the United States was morally pure. The war years included segregation, racial inequities, and the confinement of civilians under fear. But the POW system, as experienced by many captives, still presented a striking alternative to the ideology that had commanded them to die rather than be captured. The transformation was not always dramatic. It did not always produce gratitude or affection. Sometimes it produced confusion. Sometimes it produced resentment that the enemy seemed too comfortable. Sometimes it produced shame so deep it became silence. Yet in the historical record, the pattern of surprise is consistent. Many Axis prisoners, German, Italian, Japanese, remarked on the quality and quantity of food, the access to canteens, the stability of camp life. In Texas, Kramer notes prisoners were stunned by first meals that included foods many had not tasted in years: meat, eggs, green vegetables, milk, real coffee, sometimes even ice cream. Source: https://www.humanitastexas.org/news/articles/When Africa Corps Game Texas World War and 2 POWs Lone Star State. And in Japan's case, surprise carried an extra weight, because their ideology had insisted that capture was the end of the self. To discover life continuing, structured, fed, warmed, was to discover that identity might survive outside the old code. It meant ideology was not destiny. In the end, the coffee cup is emptied and washed. Another prisoner sits where one sat yesterday. Another morning comes. Steam rises from the roof again. Somewhere beyond Wisconsin forests, the world is reordering itself. Occupation governments, shattered cities, new constitutions, tribunals, ration lines. But inside a camp mess hall, the most persuasive lesson of the American century has already been delivered without a speech. A system that can produce abundance at scale can afford to treat enemies as humans, and can use that humanity as a kind of power. That is the larger truth this moment points toward. Freedom is not only the right to vote or speak or assemble. In wartime, freedom is also the ability to build institutions strong enough to restrain vengeance, to decide that even a captive will be fed, not because he deserves it, but because the society feeding him refuses to let hatred become its governing principle. The cream swirling in coffee is not a grand symbol on a flag. It is smaller. It is quieter. That is why it lasts, because ideology can demand sacrifice until the body collapses. But a society that can fill cups again and again, even behind wire, demonstrates something ideology cannot manufacture: durable abundance organized by rules. And in the long shadow of World War II, where so many systems competed for the right to define the future, that pale spiral in a dark cup became, for some prisoners, the first taste of a different world. Visual sources you can use while editing the documentary cut. WWII internment camp POW compound III photo. NPS page includes image source. https://www.nps.gov/hono/learn/historiculture/prisoners of war. HTM. Do with less so they'll have enough. Rationing gives you your fair share. NPS article includes poster, image, and caption. Source: https://www.nps.gov/articles/000/coffee